Okay, so to move forward, so some of the learning objectives today are going to be to discuss the central findings of the academic research on waking experiences of the deceased, describe the issues commonly voiced in relation to these experiences, and describe what factors may predict these experiences. And so a lot of this information is going to come from a recent publication that I had done with some fellow colleagues on the topic. And so the title of the manuscript is The Bereavement Experience, Dreams, and Waking Experiences of the Deceased. And you can find that in Dreaming. And so I won't talk much about dreams of the deceased. I've done a different echo session on that already. So if you're interested in that, you can go to the recordings that are saved on YouTube on this area. And then I'll be using the term waking experience. Some may call these visions. And I really find that this is unclear language of what participants really considered what a vision of the deceased is in the research. So, for example, if they heard the deceased or felt the touch while awake but saw nothing, would that also be considered a vision in their response? And we don't know. And then maybe people that have different understandings of what a vision is. And maybe it's only if you're spiritual, you sort of would use that kind of language. So the language of vision is kind of ambiguous, and it does have these supernatural kind of overtones, kind of like after death communications, but sometimes the research will use to understand some of these experiences. There's an alternate word that's frequently used also, and it's called hallucinations. So they'll say grief or bereavement hallucinations, but this can have pathological implications to it and to people's understanding of it. And so it's really too early to really speculate on the causes of such experiences. So I tend to use the more neutral term waking experiences just when I can. And so I first heard about kind of these experiences when I was looking at some of the research on dreams and end of life experiences. And so they discuss this. They discuss these end of life dreams and visions. And there's been a lot of press on these. And so, how common are these at end of life? So, we'll start at end of life and then we'll go to bereavement. And so, the research kind of sort of describes end of life as defined as in individuals are in a hospice inpatient unit until death or discharge. And so, Kerr in 2014 found that 88% of those patients had an end of life dream or vision. And of those, 84% of participants reported having an experience while asleep, so that would be considered a dream. Well, 55% of these had it while they were awake. And some people had it both times, right? And then you had another researcher, Dam, in 2016, found that 63% had one of these end-of-life dreams or visions, with 87% of those having it while they're asleep and 79% while awake. And so there's very limited data on this, but some of the studies, they don't agree on the themes, but more or less these are the general ones. And they don't really separate when the deceased is in the imagery and when they're not. But overall, some of the themes are just comforting presence, so reassurance and guidance, or the deceased is waiting for them when they die, going or preparing to go somewhere, traumatic memories, and discomforting presence. And the highest comfort ratings that have been found in the research were associated when the deceased was actually present in one of these dreams or visions. And so, as I said, there's very limited data on this, but most studies do discuss dreams and visions as kind of like one, and they don't really separate it. But for Kerr and Dam, they kind of did in the sense that they, of those who had the experience, 72% had one with the deceased in it, and for Dam, it was 79% reported having one with the deceased in it. Um, it, I will say that for Kerr's study, they didn't sort of look at deceased pets, and for Dam they did, so they included that into the calculation. So if you included deceased pets, Kerr's probably would go up a little bit more. And then the other thing they found is that as patients approached death, there was a dramatic increase in the frequency of seeing the deceased, which I think is very interesting. But really, due to this finding and the press around these end-of-life dreams and visions, I personally have heard people that they felt that because they were having either a dream or one of these waking life experiences of the deceased, that they thought they were going to die soon, which I think is interesting, but it goes, like if you only know a little bit about the research and it's at the end of life, you kind of assume that it's for everything, and so you must be dying soon too. And so there's an issue there with the limited education on the fact that the bereaved are also having this experience, and that's kind of why we want to talk about this because it does get less press than these end of life dreams and visions kind of do. And I'm guessing if that many people, if this is really the only thing you've ever heard about, you would probably think that too. And so, like, it's really opening my eyes to sort of the bereavement journey and how often we forget to sort of look back when we talk about end of life dreams and visions and what happens at end of life, like what actually happened in their grief journey and how does that relate to these experiences at end of life. And I probably would think if we did the research that most people, if not all people, that are having these experiences at end of life probably had it at some point in their bereavement journey. And so to hopefully get that research done will really help with those links on the correlations there. And so it is common for the dying patients to exhibit delirium and other cognitive dysfunctions, such as dementia or neurological disorders at end of life. But research has shown that many of these dreams and waking experiences, also called like end of life experiences, have really different key elements to them. And you sort of see in the chart here from Depner in 2022 on some of the differences that, from these delirium to end of life experiences. And so the key that they're trying to say is that we shouldn't discount these experiences and say they're from cognitive dysfunction. It really prevents those at end of life from really further understanding these experiences and also the potential meaning and comfort that they can bring to others. Additionally, since these experiences also happened during bereavement, well, they didn't have delirium back then. So yeah, I think it allows us to give us more information on the uniqueness of these experiences, bringing in bereavement to this topic. But using discernment is always important. And if you want to know more about this stuff at end of life, Dr. Christopher Kerr has a TED Talk. It's really good on it. And he has 5.5 million views, which I think is quite amazing. And so he is the chief medical officer at the Center of Hospice and Palliative Care in Buffalo. And he and his team actually has been on my podcast a few times. And he's written this book, which it's pretty good. And it tells you his journey into really looking into this topic and being when many people weren't. Okay, so now we're going to switch over to bereavement. So now you know a little bit about the end of life, which a lot of said like a lot of press and information is out there. So now let's move over to what's going on within bereavement. And so first, I want to ask you what your thoughts are on this. How common do you feel these waking experiences are for the of the deceased for people in bereavement? Let's say the first year of loss. How often do you think people would have one of these experiences? This could be seeing the deceased, hearing the deceased, maybe feeling their touch, or maybe even smelling the deceased. So if you put in the chat what you think the percentages, do you think it's like 5% of people, 10% of people, 50% of people? What are your thoughts? All right, we got some 80s, 75. Okay, we got the lower one, 25. 90. Oh, wow. Oh my, amazing. 55, 20. I hear it often from groups, pretty much everyone. Wow, interesting. 80%. So you see all those numbers coming through, and it seems the majority of people are saying the majority of people, which is very interesting. Um, it- Before I researched this, I would say hardly anyone. I would say like 5%. 70%, 80%. Oh, very interesting. Okay, next question is it more common for the bereaved to see, to hear, to feel, or see the deceased? So pick one and put it in. What are your thoughts? And oh, hear the deceased. Okay, feel. Oh, we got a smell. Yeah, a lot of feeling and seeing. So yeah, it seems to be for the people that are chiming in, it's a lot of feeling and seeing, or the biggest one. Smelling and hearing, maybe not as much. And we'll see what the data source says on that. But we're still learning. And at the end of the day, it's very interesting. Okay. So I'm going to share a little bit of my research first and then some of the research from past studies. And so I did two different studies that looked at this. And the first one looked at, we asked about basically these waking experiences, seeing, hearing, and feeling. We didn't ask about smelling. That was an oversight, and we should have. But both studies inquired about also dreams at the time. And so, unlike the end of life literature, we were able to separate the sort of the waking and sleeping experiences, which allowed us to understand the relative frequency of both, but also how they related to one another. And so, in study one, we looked at individuals who had a death of a romantic partner or spouse. And then in the second study, we looked at individuals who had a death of a pet or cat in the prior 6 months. And so for the measures, as sort of said, like we looked at for a continuing bond scale, which had these three questions in it about seeing, hearing, and feeling the deceased touch. And then we had a dream questionnaire that asked about the dreams in the last month. And so what we found was that looking at how common these waking experiences are for the deceased in the last month for them, was that 44% heard the deceased, 35% felt the deceased touch, and 23% saw the deceased. So as some of the people were talking about in the chat, hearing and feeling seem to be the most common. And then if you actually like combine them all to sort of see like how often it is that at least one of those would happen within the participants, 51% indicated they had at least one of these in the prior month. And if we added smell in, that would definitely, jump it up a little bit more. And then for pet loss, you kind of see the same trend, a little less in the sense of the percentages, but 27% heard the deceased, 22% felt the deceased touch, and 13% saw the deceased. And so overall, 32% had at least one of these in the prior month. And then just to look at the dreams in the last month for these individuals after partner loss, it was 74% of participants reported having one of these dreams of the deceased, and after pet loss, it was 59%. And then what we found is when sort of combining them to having at least one of these dreams or waking experiences, it was 83% after partner loss and 68% after pet loss. And if you remember those end of life numbers, they're around 88% and 63%. So you sort of see it's very similar in the sense of numbers within the last month between those that are bereaved and also those at end of life. And then looking at the relationship between dreaming to these waking experiences, what we found in both studies that there was a significant association between dreaming of the deceased and also having these waking experiences. So there is some type of link going on there. We don't know much more than that, but it's very interesting to just know to be able to do further research to explore this connection. And then looking at other research out there, so there's been a few studies conducted looking at these waking experiences of the deceased, and so they found that these are not rare, although the ranges, depending on the sample or method, were a bit different. So you can sort of see seeing the deceased had a large variation, but then there's hearing, feeling, and smelling seems to be the least likely for someone. And then just to try to understand these, so there's different theories out there that could possibly help with understanding, what is occurring. One is from Dr. O'Connor, who is an associate professor at psychology at the University of Arizona, and she studies what happens in our brains when we experience grief. So she says grieving is a form of learning and one that teaches us how to be in the world without someone we really care about in it. And so she says the brain has an expectation of what should be there, and you need to begin to predict their absence over their presence. And so learning takes time and real world experience, and our brain is doing our best to really help us through these difficult processes. And she has this TED talk and that actually really helps understand the grieving brain. And then she has this book, The Grieving Brain, that actually talks about very slightly these experiences, and so she really mentions that even though we know that the person is dead, there is a system within the brain that is still trying to learn that. And so it's still running out there. And she really ties this to attachment neurobiology, where the bond is encoded in the brain. And the system is still telling us that they're out there in many ways. And so our brain is really struggling to understand what has happened. And it's really difficult for the brain to learn that they're not going to be around. And so part of what she was saying too is in the chapter is that these external experiences of the deceased could be part of that, the brain kind of learning and basically projecting that. And then looking at my own research, understanding what factors predict can help us understand a little bit more of maybe what's going on. And so, when looking at these factors, trauma symptoms seem to be a predictor in people having these experiences. And so that can be people who have the intrusion, avoidance, and hyperarousal. And so it could be a red flag that people who are going through trauma, like for one reason or another, the mind is projecting these experiences. Another one that was associated and predicted this was avoidant attachment to the deceased. And so people who know about attachment styles, people with an avoidant attachment style, they suppress their emotions as a way of coping. And so one of the theories that me and my supervisor kind of talked about was that maybe when one is suppressing their emotions, the mind projects these experiences to help us connect with the grief that we're avoiding, to sort of connect with it and grieve. Some other research on this that can provide some insights into this is we looked at post-traumatic grief measures. So this basically measures personal growth following a stressful event or trauma, and it needs to exceed the growth that would occur from everyday experiences. So for these waking experiences, what's interesting is that they were positively related to post-traumatic growth for people. Um, but this was not true outside acute bereavement. So in those early stages, in the first year or two, they seem to be related. There's been one other study that looked at this from Field and Falansky in 2009, and they found that this was not related to post-traumatic growth. But the difference between our research was I was looking more of acute bereavement. They're looking at bereavement about 4 to 5 years. Most of their sample was outside of bereavement, and so the theory here that we're thinking is that these waking experiences could be an attempt to regulate emotion in the absence of more conscious deliberation strategies, hence that like attachment avoidance. And such intrusive experiences may actually provoke and help the individuals with it, which is interesting. But it may not be as helpful, 3, 4, 5 years outside of the death. And then we, looking at end of life, what they found that participants experiencing these end of life dreams or visions had significant higher overall post-traumatic scores compared with those who had not. So once again, it's a sign that these can actually are helping individuals, but there's still so much left to be able to do. And then the other question that people will ask is it an after-death communication? Is it like a spirit? And so there's no way for us to test that. And so no one will ever know what it is, but I want to sort of just comment on that. So it's important that we know about this because people may believe it is. And if they do, it's really about what it means for them, because how is it comforting or distressing to them if they believe it's an after-death communication? There's this um, I guess, idea that if a lot of times it's supposed to be positive if you feel it's an after-death communication, but that's not always the case. So it's really important to listen to how people interpret these experiences, to not judge them, but to really seek to understand how to support them. And so one's culture and religious beliefs can have an impact on how people interpret these experiences. So it's really good to never assume that you know. And just as with dreams, certain cultures will have their own ways of working with these experiences. So, for example, an experience of an individual could be a sign that the soul is not at rest or at peace, or that they're not reincarnated. And if that's the case, then there are actions usually within their own culture or rituals that they can do to sort of help with that. And so, overall, um, it's a commonplace, it seems, that for the bereaved to have these waking experiences of the deceased. And clearly, this phenomenon requires more study, including the roles it plays in adjusting to bereavement. Like maybe this is helping individuals, maybe it's hindering certain individuals in processing their grief, and we just need to know more about that. And also, how does it affect people at one's end of life? And so, from a clinical perspective, it's important for the bereaved, and also said the dying, and also those who are supporting them to really recognize and normalize these experiences of both the waking experiences that people can have and also the dreams. In the absence of such awareness, distress can really occur from thinking that some of these experiences reflect maybe an underlying psychological problem. And so, given this, people can really have hesitation to share these experiences, which is probably a reason why more people aren't researching it or talking about it, just because a lot of it's hidden. And that's kind of happened with the dreams. Like, not many people were exploring these experiences, and then a lot of individuals didn't think it was like so common until you start do the research and realize, oh no, it's just common, just no one's really sharing about it. So it's really important to ask about these experiences if you're supporting someone, just to give them permission to share. And then to educate them, to normalize and validate these experiences, ask questions on how it makes them feel. And I always like to say thank them for sharing, but it takes courage to share some things that, they may have not shared with anyone else, and just to be reminded of that. Okay, here are just some references. And then if you want to know more about just dreams, this is sort of the podcast that I run. And some people on there has sort of talked about experiences they've had. If it was hearing, I remember an individual talking about hearing their cat after they died. And then also an individual talked about smelling their deceased sister at different times. And my own personal experience, with this is that after that individual actually came on the podcast about smelling the deceased, his sister. It was about like I would say like 5 months after, where I was in this open field and just waiting for a friend, and I smelt my dad. And my dad had been dead probably for over 5 years at that point. And it was the first time I had any of these experiences. So I never saw him, I never heard him or felt like his touch. But I smelt them and I knew it was his smell. He has a distinct, like, I don't know, body odor. And it wasn't like a cologne or anything. And I remember sitting there like thinking, what is going on right now? And not really sure about where to put it because I didn't know this research at the time. And it was just a very fascinating moment for me where I just kept in the back of my mind. And it's amazing, like we're talking about it now. And like at the time, I didn't share it with anyone. Just like when I had a dream of my dad, I didn't share it with anyone. And so hopefully this can help just like normalize those experiences if we are having them. But it seems like in the chat, so many people said that they expect this. And so I'm guessing part of it's from the people are telling them, but also they probably had it maybe themselves. And so we could hear some of those stories later on. But I want to now move over to talking to Marnie and Paul about their professional and kind of personal experiences when it comes to this topic. And so, Marnie, I want to bring you up first to sort of talk a little bit more about um, just about supporting the bereaved and how long have you been doing that for? Because I know you're a legend in the area, and so how long have you been actually supporting the bereaved?
I'm 30 years working at Victoria Hospice, and before that, a volunteer, and before that, a student. So, yeah, probably nearing on 35 years or so.
Wow. Oh my God, that's amazing and great for you. Thank you for doing the work that you're doing for 35
A
years.
privilege. It is a privilege.
And so I'm really curious about just training because we're talking about like grief literacy and like have you ever been trained in any of this? Have you explored this in like has anyone ever really explored this in training at all? In bereavement or end of life? I'm just really curious on your perspectives of this topic in general.
I'm so glad you're asking the question and doing the work, Joshua, because no, that was not at all part of my professional training or education. I can't even remember any colleagues in my cohort being curious about it or studying it when I was at university. It's certainly a conversation we have regularly in my team of bereavement counselors within our program, and part of what we talk about when we're onboarding new staff and new volunteers. just to sort of name and normalize that these experiences are happening for people and for us to be open and curious about them. But no, not at all part of my academic or professional training at all.
That's so fascinating to me. 'Cause, yeah, it wasn't in mine either. And I've also taken three training programs at different hospices, and none of this was never brought up or mentioned, which I think is interesting. And I think it goes to question, why do you feel that maybe it's under researched or under discussed?
I think there's a lot of silence around it. Like I don't think we hear about it from everybody that's experiencing it. So I think it flies a little bit under the radar. I also worry and wonder about kind of stigma and people feeling self-conscious about it. Like how will I be perceived if I share that this is happening? What will it mean? What does it say about me? So I think people are nervous to kind of raise the experience and put it out there for others to know and hear about. Um, I also think, I mean, academia and our training still really struggles with anything that isn't hard science and really concrete and provable. And so it's, very, my experience is pretty new, Joshua, that people like you are inviting the dialogue and asking the questions and pulling it forward into academia so that it's understood and recognized and legitimized in that way. I think professional schools are still very kind of stuck in a concrete evidence-based sort of mindset, and there hasn't been a ton of evidence.
I guess like the only real thing is like I said, like trying to figure out how many people are having them. Like that's just like some numbers to try to figure that out because that's the same thing that happened almost with like nightmares. People now know nightmares are very common, but I remember my supervisor telling me in my PhD that when she was trained to be a clinical psychologist, they thought at that time anyone who had nightmares had psychological issues, and so no one would voice that they had nightmares because there's that myth was going
Yeah.
on. And so then she did some research and found out most people have a nightmare, during a year. And same thing with, sexual abuse that came around. People thought it was like one in a million. She wasn't even trained. She said it's so rare, we're never going to train you. And then all her clients seemed to have sexual abuse traumas. And then she did research and found out that's actually more common than we thought. And so I think just in life, sometimes just the numbers is like a shock because it goes against some of the myths that we're told.
Mhm.
But yeah, and so hopefully that helps people, like I said, like just normalize it. And I think that's, part of when we like trying to understand grief. It's like, what are these experiences? And I think for me, I like to come at it as I have no idea like what it all means, but I can acknowledge that it exists. Same thing with like dreams, right? Like I'm not here to tell you what it means, but I'm just here to say like and validate, yeah, this seems to be common and it's part of the human grief journey. And there's something mysterious and something going on here that deserves more more research and more time on.
Mm. And I think to know that when we're hearing these kinds of experiences, when people are sharing their stories, we don't have to validate or invalidate them. We don't have to say, yes, this is real or true or not, but to really be open and curious. Like one of the things that I always do when these come up in my work with people is, so what sense are you making of it? Like, how is this living within you? What are you doing with this story? To really kind of come back to the person and explore how this is impacting them without sort of needing to add any layer for me about what I think or how I'm interpreting it, just to really invite conversation.
I love that. And I think it's so important for I think everyone here. Like it's great to be able to ask about these experiences, but it's also important to have that safe space where you're not trying to interpret what these experiences should mean for the individual, but to like listen and see how they like make sense of it. And so in your practice, like do you ever ask the question or is just people are sharing these experiences with you because they trust you? Is that like
I think it's a mix of both,
hmm,
actually,
hmm.
Joshua. Sometimes I will lead and invite the dialogue, and other times, and often it just comes up as part of the work that we're doing with people. It's often framed in a conversation for me where I kind of weave my way in that's something like, what do you believe happens after people die? What's your way of understanding what happens when we die? And that often is a pathway into conversations around people's experiences, as you've said, either through dreams or in waking life.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, it's an interesting way of like going about it. And but you'll get this certain kind of I guess maybe individual who's maybe more spiritual, open to talk about it? Or they, do you find that it may be, like a distressing experience for them, or do you find it more comforting for them if they sort of maybe believe in the afterlife?
Yeah, I'm gonna say in terms of waking life experiences, I would
Yeah.
say almost universally positive. I can't
Mhm.
recall in 30 years a story that was negative. More often and still the minority in dreams, sometimes dreams are distressing to people, but the distress is usually related to I have a feeling my person is trying to connect with me and I don't know what they're trying to say or why they're here. There's kind of that sort of distress more than something kind of obviously or directly awful is happening in that dream. It's
Mhm.
more a sense of my person's coming for me and I don't know what the message is.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I wonder if some of those other people that said that maybe weren't spiritual, it may be more distressing for them because they don't know how to make sense of it, and they may think um, it means something about where they are, mentally. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think kind of back to the beginning of what I was saying, these are difficult things often for people to raise. It's uncomfortable to say, I'm sure I felt my husband hug me today, or I saw my person walk by, or your story about smelling your dad. Like they're difficult things for people to raise, but I noticed in the chat, like somebody said, as soon as one person brings it up in a bereavement group, everyone's like, "Oh yeah, and me
Uh,
too, and this happened to me." So I think it just takes somebody to kind of break the
mm,
ice and normalize that, even for people outside of a kind of spiritual or religious context to understand it and hold it. It's just the kind of, I think, fear and worry about how will I be perceived if I share this story?
that's so true. Yeah, just having one person with an experience that you've had can really open you up to sort of feel that it's safe to share because you're not going to be the only one at this point. And then it's just like, how do we sit with all those different understandings, interpretations of that? And so that's beautiful that, people have seen it within their support groups. I think I like that a lot. And I think too, when we talk about signs, there's so many different ways people kind of re or feel that their signs exist or sensing the presence of the deceased in different ways. Sometimes it's not through the actual deceased, it's like from a bird, or maybe they find coins, or it's like I said, dreams. And so it's always like interesting to see where people connect. It could be music, that they sort of feel the deceased is, connecting with them. But it's not always the case for everyone. And so, yeah, it's really interesting to chat a little bit more about that for you. Is there anything else you want to sort of say on the subject? Do you have any other experiences that you want to, or case studies or your own personal experience you want to share before we bring up Paul?
Yeah, just I think a couple of stories, Joshua.
Yeah.
Like I love that you brought up music because actually that's something I hear a lot about in my work with people as a grief counselor that, on the way to the session, this particular song came on that's never on the radio and it has some association or connection with their person who died, or in some difficult moment the song comes to mind or is on the radio. So music, I think, is something that we haven't really named, but I think is a really important kind of connection with the deceased. And I also really like that you're naming, like, it may not be a literal manifestation of the person. Like it might not be a see, hear, smell, touch of the person, but like you're saying, a sign. And I'll just share a personal story. When I was in grad school, there were three of us that were very tight best friends, kind of carrying us through a difficult grad school program. And one of my friends was killed suddenly and unexpectedly while we were midstream in that program. And in my kind of despair and disorientation on the day that she died, I bought three flowers to represent each of us and took them to the ocean. And I tossed the three flowers into the waves and stood at the waves, and two flowers came back and one didn't. And for me, that was a very much like, my friend Jude is going on without us, and we're still here in this world. We're coming back to shore and have to be here. So, I think there are moments like that that happen for people as well that we
Mm.
call signs, or that people connect to their person who's died that maybe isn't that direct representation of their person. That's all I'll share.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for sharing and like I said, just opening conversation up in this area, especially from a professional view and how we can sort of sit with people that are having these experiences, and just sit in the mystery of them, really. Okay, Paul, thank you for being here. It's great to be able to chat with you again. I know we ran into each other at a conference, and we're talking about this paper that was published, and you really provide this very interesting story, and I really wanted others to really hear about it. So thank you so much for being here to share. So if you could you talk a little bit about Susan and kind of your grief journey, and then tie in how this was a part of it?
Right. It's Suzanne, actually,
Oh,
but
Suzanne, sorry. Yeah.
uh, yeah. So Suzanne had breast cancer over 4 years. We had have had two kids who were teenagers when all this was happening. Um, and I guess I would say that the in the 6 months before she died, my son was really gripped with terrible anticipatory grief, and my daughter was a little bit maybe in denial until the last 6 or 8 weeks, and then she suffered to a greater extent later. And I would say my own experience was that I was so focused on them that I wasn't much in touch with my own sort of experience at the time. I mean, I was certainly grieving, I was certainly suffering, but I was really always, when people would ask me how I was doing, I would start talking about how everybody else was doing and manage to get out of the conversation without actually saying anything about myself. So when we started talking about this at this conference where we bumped into each other a year or so ago, I was quite excited because I had really never even though I'm head of the Grief Alliance and had talked with lots of people in this area, and I was in a bereavement group after Suzanne died, but I had never heard the subject come up, and I think I was puzzled by my own personal experience. Something that I don't think I mentioned to you was in the early days after Suzanne died, I used to walk a lot along the river that's sort of 100 meters from the house here. And she was a keen cyclist. And if somebody's got a cycle helmet on and wraparound sunglasses, they can all look a little bit but the same. And I kept thinking I saw her. I kept like, and I would have this jarring thing where, oh, that's Suzanne. And of course, I used to walk along there before and never had that experience, even though there would have been people. But I think the experience I mentioned to you was that I had not even acknowledged to myself that this was happening, that I was hearing Suzanne's voice when I was sitting in the house. I would hear her calling me from another room. So I'd be sitting watching television or something, and she would call my name, just my name. That's all I would hear. I'd hear Paul from the kitchen or from another room. And I'm a fairly rationalistic person. I'm not a spiritual person. I found it mildly disconcerting, I think, because it would sort of take me out of where I was and take me back to the grief, I guess. But I really pushed it out of like my consciousness in a way until my daughter, who was then 14, Sophia, came up to me one day and she said, "I'm hearing mom talk to me." And it was clearly quite disturbing to her. Like I don't mean to say that she was unhappy about it, but she didn't know what to make of it. And when she said that to me, I realized, well, I could say, well, I'm having this experience too. And I think at the same time as it normalized it for her, and it kind of awakened me to the fact that I was actually having that experience at a certain level. I was pushing away from my consciousness. So it's something that I've heard so much over the last years as I've talked to people about grief, is that it is such an individual experience, and often you might think you're crazy, or you might think, or you don't know what to make of it. I thought of them as auditory hallucinations. I know that's a word you don't like to use, but that was my explanation to myself of what was going on, and I think it's so useful for people to know that other people have had these experiences because it normalizes them. It makes it easier to deal with them, and as you say, I don't. How do you understand it? I was very interested to hear the book you were saying that talked about it's a way of reintegrating the fact of the loss and other people might interpret it spiritually, but just to know that you're not going crazy, or you're not like it's good to know that that it's a such a common experience. And I certainly didn't know that really until I met you. Like I still, even when I realized Sophia and I were having similar experiences, I still didn't realize that we weren't this sort of tiny island in the sea until I met you and realized, oh, holy moly, like there's so many people out there having this or similar experiences.
That's so interesting, as you're sort of saying. It was because your daughter kind of like brought that up, and it's interesting like what we push away in our experiences if they don't, if it doesn't fit, if we haven't heard about it.
Right,
And so that's great that she was able to talk about that. And it also brings me up to an interesting question of children who may have these experiences. I wonder if they're just if they have more of them or less of them than maybe adults would, and like how do they interpret those experiences?
right.
Like as adults, we're still having a difficult time. Like what it would do for children is a very another interesting question and study for people who, I guess, work with children to ask them
Right.
these questions because I know they're also having dreams of the deceased, but if they're having these waking experiences too, like how are they making sense of these
Yeah.
as they sort of move forward?
Yeah.
And so what did you think? So you said you said it was like only maybe a few people you thought you were on an island. What do you think about these numbers that it seems that like over 50%, if not more, will have this type of experience at some point in their grief journey?
Well, I was very interested in the group chat because I knew, because I had read your paper. So like at that point, I realized that this is an experience an awful lot of people have. But when you asked the question in the group chat, I thought people were going to say 5% or 10% or 12%. And instead, people are giving like large numbers that are kind of closer to what your research. So, I mean, the interesting thing to me is that that means that the folks who are on this call are in like aware of it, engaged with it, and are like that. So it kind of confirms your research in a way, but it's heartening to me that people are aware of it so that they can start to think about how to talk about it. Right?
Yeah, I was expecting the same thing as you, Paul. The low numbers, but with these 80s, I'm like I never thought that. And so like yeah, I'm really curious to sort of hear more about maybe people's opinions on like why they sort of feel that that's the way. And so is there anything else, Paul, you'd want to sort of share on this topic?
Uh, no, I don't think so. But I just beyond just saying and confirming something that Marnie said and you've alluded to, which is that people like as I say, I'm a quite rationalistic person. I don't, I'm not a religious person. I interpreted it in a particular way, but I think it's hugely important not to devalue the what people invest in those experiences, that like what people believe those experiences to be is important, and they it shouldn't be dismissed.
I have actually one question for you, Paul, because I've never actually done this myself. So I've always asked people about their dreams. It's just like what I do, right? If someone talks about their grief, I've never once asked about these waking experiences, which I think is really interesting on my end. Have you ever asked anyone about their waking experiences?
No,
Yeah, it's fascinating, right?
no, I mean, I think it's a little bit, Marnie alluded to this at the time. I I don't think I thought, oh, I'm nuts, I'm going nuts or something, but I thought people might think I'm going nuts if I start talking about it.
Right.
And in that, like one of the burdens of that first period of grief is that people keep saying, how are you doing? And they want to be reassured. They don't want you to be telling them, um, like I can't sleep at night and I'm hearing her voice. And they actually want there's I don't want to say all people, but a lot of the people who ask, How are you?" are really asking, "Would you please reassure me that I don't have to sort of pay any more attention to this?" Right?
I see. Okay, yeah, yeah. Do you think it's going to be something you're going to ask for someone moving forward or no? Like even let's say outside maybe the acute phase. Like is it something that you would ever bring up to someone maybe 5 years out to sort of say,
Well,
"Oh, by the way,
I
have you
mean,
ever?"
I think maybe I should, because I often people reach out to me who are recently bereaved, and we talk a little bit about the experience and so on. And it's not something typically that they raise, and perhaps
Yeah.
I should raise, because, as I say, like, one of the difficult things about grief is how isolating it is. And it is obviously individual, like pain, right? Um, you can't share somebody else's pain, you can't share their grief, but you can. It sometimes can be helpful to know that other people have gone through similar experiences, and to hear about how they manage them, how they metabolize them, how
Right.
they went through them.
Okay, yeah, I like that. And it could be rather than just asking, you say, "Oh, I had this weird experience or I had this interesting experience when I was grieving. Did you
Right,
have anything like this kind of thing?" And it kind of allows them to sort of come
right,
say, "Oh,
right,
you've had it." Like I'm more open to share than just asking straight up.
right, right, right.
Okay, thank you, Paul. And we got Marnie.
A question for you, Joshua,
Yeah,
because you've asked both Paul and I, are we asking
yeah.
this question with people? I kind of want to put you on the spotlight and ask, what do you think might be the value of that?
Well, I think it's for me, it's like with the dream stuff too. It's normalizing the experiences if they do have them. If they don't, it's normalizing that other people around them may be having that. And if it is brought up, it's okay. And so I think it gives people like a space to be able to share um, some things that they probably have never shared before. And if you're a safe space to share, you'll get this a lot of other stuff that comes along with it. As I said, I think I was mentioning to you before, because I ask for dreams, I sometimes get people sharing these other experiences of signs and other things that they've had happen, if they're spiritual or not. And it's because I asked a question they haven't asked before, and they felt safe to sort of then dump all this other stuff that they haven't also shared either. So I think it just opens different doors for people to increase their own grief literacy, which I think is a huge thing because they're going to be supporting people in their life moving forward, but also be able to look at their own life in a different detail to sort of talk about something they haven't really talked about before. And I bet you there's people that had these experiences and it's 50 years out and never shared that experience to others, positive or negative. And so I think it's allowing us to be more truthful with our grief journey just allows, I think, the world to have a different walk with grief and a different understanding of grief.
Yeah, thank
Nice.
you.
Well, I've never been put on the spot. I like that. And I like the question. Okay, so we are open to any other questions. So if anyone wants to share their experiences, I know there's a bunch in the chat I haven't been able to read, but if you want to raise your hand and share, maybe if you have an experience or you see in a group something that you'd want other people to share, or if you have a question for any of us, feel free to raise your hand, or I guess you can put in the chat. And oh, we got Wade. Where'd you go, Wade? Oh,
And
there
I
you are.
was
Okay,
looking,
okay.
I was looking for the unmute. Um, yeah, I'm happy to share an experience that, again, I don't get to talk about a lot, but a particular experience for me, and there's a lot of aspects to it. This happened for me about 10 years ago. It was about a month or two after my mom had died, and just over, or a month or two after my grandma had died, and just over a year after my mom had died. It's interesting you mentioned the trauma piece in the midst of it. I was in the midst of um, around an estate conflict that was so traumatic that I was having yeah, a lot of trauma symptoms in my life. And I went for a healing touch appointment and I had a practitioner working on me. So I was on the table. And so it was a waking experience, but I was in that deep relaxation of that's almost a liminal space. And I did experiences of loved ones, deceased loved ones, a general felt sense of like, oh, like I feel mum, or like it feels like they're close. And I'd had that experience, but this one was very specific in the midst, in that sort of liminal space, um, on the table with a very experienced practitioner attending to me. And the practitioner was at my head at the table. And all of a sudden, with my eyes closed, I had a very visual, clear, specific visual and felt experience of my grandma on the left, my mom on the right, and my brother, who had died over 20 years before, at the foot of the bed at the table. And the visual piece was really specific because, I sort of had my my memory of my brother at about the age he was, memory of my mom about the age she was died, but my grandma was younger than she was when she died. And so I remember noting like, oh, there's something very specific here. Um, and there were two major gifts I received from that, besides it being a very comforting presence with I was going through so much. My mom, it's not that I heard her voice, but I received words from her that were some very comforting words for that moment in time. And so that experience really helped support me in that particular moment and challenge I was going through. But it also healed a piece of my grief for with my brother that it was, over 20 years past that I was a young teenager when my brother died. He was 8 years older than me. And in the grieving and in the time after, I really had the experience that other people knew my brother better than I did, that he was just kind of my general big brother. And I felt like I was just starting to get to know him. I was just at an age where we could get to know each other differently. So when other people would talk about my brother, I feel like I didn't get to know that part of him. And so in my grief and as the years went on, I was like, did I really know him? And that was sort of this lingering question and unease. And in seeing him and sensing his presence, I had a very felt sense and memory of like, oh right, that's who he was. I remember who he was. I remember how it felt to be with him. I feel remember the felt connection with him, and he just had this smile and this warmth. And so I feel like the one gift was a gift for the moment, but the other was like a long healing that has stayed with me. Um, the message from mom was a message for that moment, but the message from him, or just that experience of him, that unease and that live question I've had carried for like 20 years has just settled. And I don't wonder if I knew my brother anymore. So I've never had that kind of specificity of experience before. And in my spiritual life, I do have experience of just sort of trusting the mystery of things that are beyond what we know, So I was able, so my practice has been just to receive the gift of that without needing to understand it or add meaning or attach ideas or do thinking about it. Other than just receiving what it was and saying, I don't know how that works. I don't know what it means as far as even that my grandma looked younger. I don't know. But there was like incredible gift in it. So I just received the gift of it.
Wow. That's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing. And yeah, it's very interesting to be able to sit in the mystery and be able to have everyone, because like a lot of times we're talking, it's like one person here, one person there, but you had like three people at the same time, and that is very interesting. And I wonder how common that is to have more than one person in one of these experiences. Like that's very interesting to me, and I'm really happy that it was so comforting and it helped in so many different ways, and some that we don't even know. And I think that's what's so interesting about some of these experiences and like the power of love. Like sometimes we don't know the full extent of it. But you can definitely, just by the way you're sharing, how impactful it was. And even for your brother, it said like 20 years. And sometimes we can, we carry this stuff with us and don't realize how deep it goes. And these experiences can really bring it back up to a point where we're different now. Like I think we've learned a lot along the way. We had different losses, and to be able to go back and think about your brother in a different way and to have that moment, like who would have thought? Like that was like one of the things that, you needed along the way. And I think that's like life can kind of bring us these moments where sometimes we just don't know what we need, and we get these things that kind of like shift us. And I'm really happy you had that because, like where would you be without that? As you're saying, like you just be a different person, maybe walking a little bit more heavy. So yeah, anyways, thank you so much for sharing. I appreciate that. And um, yeah, and have you had anything more beyond that? So have you just had that and that was it, or have you had other moments like after that where you saw or heard just one time? Wow.
just
Okay.
just the one time of that kind of like I say, some other more broad ones, and maybe one other brief piece about like how the gifts and how these carry forward. Someone I supported on their deathbed, this was the day before they died, and shared that like they had experienced when their dad had died, they've had a felt sense of their dad staying with them by their side for the years ahead. They often felt their dad close until this person's mom died. And then I said, once mom died, dad was gone. And it gave them so much comfort to know that it's like, oh, dad was waiting for her. There was no anxiousness about his presence or whatnot. And this is and so on this person's deathbed that I was supporting, they were like, "Yeah, I'm not afraid of death because I felt dad with me. It was a comforting presence, and dad went with mom. So I trust. I don't know what comes next, but again, it was a similar theme of like he was able to trust what comes next because of that experience. So I think about the gifts in the moment, but the gifts that those experiences continue to give us, and right to someone's deathbed.
Oh, that's so interesting. And I like too, like I said, it stopped when the mom died. Like that's an interesting thing, like how long these continue and like the meaning behind some of the things when they do stop and how people make sense of that and how it shifted her view of death, like to not be afraid of it. I think that's a very powerful lesson. Amazing. And so is there anyone else that wants to share or any other questions? Let's see, also what's in the chat. Oh, Jane?
Hi. I just put it in the chat, but I'll go
Okay.
ahead and since no one's coming up. Yeah, I'm just curious. We're going to be doing some training tonight on this with our hospice volunteers, and we're working with someone who is like an intuitive for this kind of work. And I just noticed what I noticed there's a theme. This is so common. Like it's interesting to me that you found it surprising that so many people have this experience because I feel like it's so common that when people don't have this experience, they worry that it like either says something about the relationship or they're not open enough or like they feel like it's almost like a complete it would be like a completion of their grief experience to have this happen to them or that they're missing out on that part of the grief experience because I think it is becoming more known in the common culture around grief and bereavement. So I'm just curious what you would say to that.
Yeah, I wonder if it's just like a sign they're looking for or like what the meaning is behind what they're looking for. Because I know they people have that with dreams where they really can long for to see them
Yes.
or hear them again. And they can get jealous of those who have them if they don't
Mhm.
have it. And so, like some of the research on that was, I looked at it to calm their mind on not complicating their grief. As you said, like some people will judge it, saying, "Oh, maybe they don't love me anymore. Maybe they didn't cross over. Maybe they're not
Mm.
okay." Like something like that. If they're spiritual, and even
Mm.
if you're not, you can still get jealous because you want that a new memory of them, healthy and happy, and to be
Yeah.
able to feel that love of them and that feel their hug again. And so I think for these waking experiences, though, I don't know, right? Like I know dreams are a big part, but I don't know how many people are longing for a waking experience. I know signs, personally, just any kind of sign that they're okay. I think that
Yeah.
comes from a deep love if you're spiritual and you're just caring about them. I remember there's a story of with my mom, where, as a kid, every time I went somewhere, she'd always say, "Call me when you get there," right? To know that you're okay.
Mhm.
And then even as an adult, she still has that. So I'm like 41 and I'm still gonna like text her when I, arrive safe somewhere. And then so I think it's the same thing. It's that love. And if you believe that there's something more beyond, you kind of want the reassurance that they crossed over. Because there's, I think, maybe a fear that maybe there is separation, maybe like I said, heaven and hell, maybe there's purgatory. Like we don't really know, but if someone's belief system is in that kind of way, it may they need that confirmation that they sort of are okay. And I think this out of it's coming out of love,
Mhm.
for that. But like, where do people, at the end of the day, I always sort of say, if that is a concern, especially with dreams, like you can use other people's dreams. Like we now know through research that not everyone is going to have a dream of the deceased because not everyone dreams and not everyone dreams regularly.
Mhm.
And it's those people who dream the most often are the ones that are having more of these types of experiences. And so you can always use someone else's dream or experience as your own to know that I would say, you crossed over in the way, right? If they're spiritual, to ease that tension, and not judge themselves like it's something wrong with them. It's just we're all different and we grieve differently and we have different experiences. So I
Mhm.
would say just be more allowing people to ask people around them, and not feel bad about that. I don't know, Marnie, if you have anything to say on that.
I could certainly say something. I wonder if I noticed Judith had a hand up. If Judith has a response, then I would defer. Looks like a no. Okay. Okay, separate thought. So one of the things that I do with this, and it's just what I do, it's not for everybody, but I share my 30 years of experience and an observation that I have, which is one of the things that I've noticed. It's not in research. Joshua, here's a great question if you want to take it up for me. Um, what I notice clinically is that when people are really desperate and fixated on, I need to see my person in my dream, or I want a sign when I'm awake, or I'm looking for these experiences, that they do not happen. And that it's when people kind of relax that intensity around pursuing it that they start to come.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what that's about, but it's certainly something that bears out over my 30 years of sitting with grieving people, is that I think when people are in that very intense, acute grief distress and looking for a sign and looking for a connection, it's not there. And it seems to be that as that intensity softens a little, as the focus on I need a sign relieves a little bit, that they start to come forward. But of course, as Joshua was saying, that it's not for everybody. It's not a universal. I can't say that every person I meet is going to have those, but it's something that I notice. And I think for me, it's very connected to Mary Frances O'Connor's work and what we're doing in our brains early on after grief, where I think we're very focused on finding and accessing and seeing and connecting with our person in the ways we know how. Like see them concretely, feel them concretely, have a conversation with them. I miss my person at the dinner table. And I think while those things are still really intense and active, it's very hard for kind of the, I don't know, soul, spirit, brain of us to kind of relax enough for these other connections to surface.
Interesting. That's cool.
That's
That's
what I talk about.
yeah. That's an interesting take on it. Yeah. And I just have one other quick thing. Is there any research happening with like the use of psychedelics and grief, and like what happens when people make these connections through that kind of experience? Because I know that happens on the end of life side. Is that happening on the grief side at all?
I don't know much of that research. I haven't looked into it, but I know
Okay.
they're playing around with that now. I know, Marty, if you do you know anything about any research in that area?
It's been a long time actually since I looked at the literature. I know for sure, Jane, there is some. It's very small. I
Mm-hmm.
remember a super impressive study out of, I believe, India or Iran, where they were giving psychedelics to people that were diagnosed with disordered grief, so prolonged grief disorder, and seeing some really positive results. But it's definitely not broad and mainstream yet. I'm a little out of date. I would think there is some research, but not much.
Okay. Good to
I've
know.
heard, I've had someone on my podcast talk about doing ayahuasca and meeting his deceased person, which gave him great comfort. So I think there's probably some possibilities for comfort and healing, and probably some other ones that aren't.
Mm-hmm.
That could
Totally.
be very terrifying for people.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to sort of comment because Wade mentioned he was really relaxed when he had that experience with those three people. And Marnie, you talked about being relaxed is like maybe a key to having or having an experience, which is I think very interesting to look into as we move
Mm-hmm.
forward about where someone is in that kind of frame of mind.
Good point. Thank you.
And then we had Judith that are,
Um, there's not too much background noise. I just had a little thought, which is that I was reminded recently by an article in New Yorker saying about aphantasia, aphantasia, hyperphantasia, that some of us can't picture things in our head, and some people have very, very vivid pictures in their head. So I'm one of those people who I can't kind of either with the eyes open or closed picture anything in any great detail, which and in my personal experience with grief, I haven't had any of these kinds of experiences. And I just can't imagine that that's not related. But I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on that.
that's very interesting. Yeah. And like certain people will have, I would think, less opportunity or chance to have those experiences based on um, how they can perceive or imagine or have those images within their mind. But you have to let me know if that does happen. Yeah, that'd be kind of interesting. And then do you dream? Like, is that something that happened? Like, you remember your
Oh,
dream?
yes. Oh,
Okay,
yes.
yeah.
I do
I've
at
been to,
least
okay, yeah.
do that. And certainly about people and pets who have died for sure.
Okay, interesting. Yeah. So yeah, please keep me updated if you have one of those experiences. Who knows? Maybe this triggers it. You don't really know what happens as we move forward. Because it's like we haven't done a lot of talking about this. So yeah, if you have that, please let me know. But it's a good question and good insights for as we move forward in research. Okay, and the last question, Valerie?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Sure. Oh, hi. I'm a nurse practitioner in Kingston, Ontario. I do hospice palliative care. And in my spare time, I read lots and lots of books on death and dying and various related topics. And so I just pulled up in my list, one of the recent books I just read was called The Spiritual Doorway in the Brain, a neurologist's search for the God experience. And it's older, it's 2011, but it's basically looking at the neurological, physiological, anatomical things that may be happening when people are having, in this case, near-death experiences or deathbed visions, and looking at the similarities between various experiences in relation to like using psychedelics and what actual chemical things are happening in the brain that may explain physiologically, which I found very interesting because I know that not we don't necessarily need an explanation, but as a science-based person, I found it kind of helpful to see that there was some sort of tie in to why this is happening, that it isn't just this kind of made up thing that's happening in our subconsciousness or consciousness, but rather there are scientific reasons why these things might be happening. And for some people, that may help to rationalize and help to make them feel a little bit more secure in the things that they're experiencing. But I kind of wished that it was updated because I was like, well, a lot has transpired in since 2011. Like we know a lot more. There's been a lot more research, and now that we're having more research, especially in Canada around psychedelics, like it would be super, super interesting to do some research comparing those kinds of things. But anyway, it was an interesting read. I'd recommend.
That's great. Well, thank you for sharing. And I think you're right. I think like knowing that it's a thing is one thing, and then I'm trying to understand it. And I think there's a lot of different theories now out there that can give us some understanding, so we're not sitting with too much unknown. And I think people can get kind of antsy when they don't know. And so yeah, there's probably a lot going on within the brain that we like. Well, we know there's a lot going on that we don't understand with the near-death experiences, end-of-life experiences. These dreams and bereavement that seem to be very different from normal dreams. And then these experiences that's like hearing and seeing, it'd be really interesting to capture that in a lab to see what is actually going on within the brain when these happen. But the biggest issue is you can't like produce them, right? Like you can't like to catch them is like going to be really hard. Same thing with like a dream of them. Like to catch it in the lab would be almost, very difficult to be able to do. And so we're almost left with like making up theories until we know more. But I think like
One
there's
of the
probably.
studies he talked about, just in line with that, like not being able to
Mhm.
force this, it was a huge study of nuns that they put through functional MRIs and basically wanted them to have a spiritual awakening and relationship with God that they have had many times over their lives in their work as and life as nuns. But the nuns were like, we can't just like make God appear to us while we're laying here in this MRI. And so they tried their best to like put themselves in a mindset that they would have been in, but like that it's so foreign to where you likely are in those contexts when you have those experiences. So it was kind of funny that they thought that they could just be like, okay, talk to God, go
That's
ahead. We'll just scan your brain.
Yeah, researchers are funny. I think that you just like produce it, but no, like I said, like they're kind of intrusive experiences where you have no control on like over them in some way. So yeah, they make it much more difficult to study. But at least we're talking about it, and so I appreciate everyone here today being here and talking. And there's a lot in the chat. I'll have to look at it afterwards. And thank you, Marnie and Paul, for being here. I appreciate that you took the time to come in and share your experiences because it just validates this for so many people. And so as we wrap up, just to mention our next talk is in January on January 28th. And it's going to be Marney. He's going to be speaking about grief, an action plan, and new national grief protocol. And so talk about the new website that's out there that's really good. And so if you want to check that out, we'll be able to have that link to sign up soon. And then these notes and this recording should be available within a week time. So then you can share it if this is meaningful to you and you have other people that want to listen to this. So other than that, thank you for being here today and wish you all the best for the rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye now.